told you that the next time you cross the street, a car heading your direction is suddenly unable to stop and ends up colliding with you, leaving you paralyzed from the waist down? You wouldn't believe me, right? Of course not. But why not? See, we live in a world where our lives can change in an instant due to a singular event. And we neglect this fact. It terrifies us. The idea of our whole world turning upside down, changing everything as we know it. What do we do then? How could you ever recover from that? 2 years ago, when I was but 14 years old, it happened. It all changed. First, I was diagnosed with mononucleosis, a common viral infection. The doctor claimed that for most people it's over within a week, that the most you may experience is a high fever. A few days later, I was hospitalized for a week on drip, and after I returned home, I was bound to my bed for weeks on end. And at that point, I had missed the remainder of 8th grade, and summer break had begun. And my family and I had planned to travel to Sweden, our home country. And arguably, my health was long from recovered, and my immune system was near non-existent. But after weeks of suffering, I needed to leave, to resume my life. Now, when I arrived in Sweden, I was warned of the danger getting COVID may invoke. But I didn't listen. I was warned and I rejected it. Like you all, I remember thinking, surely it can't happen to me. But on the second day in Stockholm, my mom tested positive for COVID-19. And on the third day, it was my brother. On the fourth, it was my dad. And finally, me. And I thought nothing of it. All that mattered now was a road trip to a little town by the coast of Sweden called Fisketången. And now during our road trip, breathing became difficult within hours. And after the 6-hour mark, we finally arrived in Fisketången. And I was suddenly terrified. And I spent 2 days in the little town, and the increasing difficulty of my breathing was haunting me. One of the few things I remember from those days spent by the ocean was when I began walking towards the cliffs by the water's edge. And as I trekked up the cliff, it felt as though my lungs had given up. My lips turned blue due to the lack of oxygen entering my blood. And I wanted so desperately to find some sort of reason to all this. Why this was happening to me. For the first time in my life, I was utterly alone. The next day, we spent 8 hours driving around the west coast of Sweden, visiting 3 different hospitals, which all after a brief examination claimed that there was nothing wrong with me and I was perfectly healthy. And I left each of those hospitals confused at their responses. Surely the inability to take deep breaths or walk for more than 10 minutes was anything but healthy, but regardless, I was told I was going to be okay. That it will not get worse than this. But it did. And that night, I remember faintly. But if I recall, I believe it consisted of very little sleep as I fought for small, measly breaths to keep me alive and awake. And the following morning, my inhaler ran out, meaning my only source of oxygen was cut short. And as we went to the pharmacy to pick up another, I remember staying by the car. However, without my inhaler, I was weak. I could barely talk due to the strain it put on my lungs. And suddenly, I fell to the ground. My muscles were tired and weary of carrying all the weight on limited oxygen. When I got home, I faintly remembered breaking down. I called my mom whilst bawling my eyes out, repeating the words, "I can't breathe." A few minutes later, the ambulance was called. And from there, my memory is completely wiped clean. However, above all, I remember being aware that right then could very well be my last moments. something no 14-year-old should ever have to experience. And suddenly, the doctors of the hospital who had previously rejected me claimed that my lung had collapsed and was filled with fluid. And they needed to insert a large tube through my throat, all the way into my lung, to drain the fluid and pump my lung back out. And in order to do that, I'd have to be sedated for an extended period of time, and therefore, they decided to put me in a clinically induced coma. Now, similar to regular dreams, the lucid dreams you have whilst in a coma are typically composed of the things which regularly occupied your mind prior to falling into the coma. But for me, that was the popular TV series Lucifer, which is all about the devil coming down to earth from hell, which is depicted as a continuous loop of your worst nightmares. Now, because of this, my dreams consisted of a loop where I was reborn into a hospital bed and a doctor coming in and killing me over and over again. And it remained so for 5 days straight, and I was conscious throughout it all. Naturally, when they woke me up 5 days later, as a result of this, along with the heavy psychiatric effects and the medication which I was given I was convinced I had passed away and come to hell. And that is a very scary feeling. Now, when you're put into a coma, it is not a prolonged sleep, but rather a sort of trance, where your brain begins to lucidly dream, rather than being fully cognizant like that when you are awake. However, the term medically induced means that that trance is completely fabricated with the help of anesthetics. And due to this, not only do patients suffer from the physical recovery, but also the mental roller coaster caused by these medications. In my case, I endured various hallucinations upon awakening. These included visions of God speaking to me, fabricated hallucinations of people like nurses and family members. And I vividly remember spending hours talking to what I thought was my dad. But as I then looked back, I was surprised to see I had been alone the entire time, and that my dad had in fact not been at the hospital that day to visit. Now, in a world where the ordinary and extraordinary exist side by side, there are moments that force us to pause, to question the very fabric of our existence. The 2.5 weeks of recovery challenged any prior view I had on myself in my life. The first few days are a blur. I was told later it consisted of the very inevitable yet unstoppable questions and crying. And I was still in a dreamlike state due to the medications, and I was completely paralyzed from head to toe. And I was absolutely terrified. In my mind, I had died and gone to hell, then become resurrected by God. And this, of course, forced me to, among all the fear and confusion, turn to religion for comfort. And this, of course, gave my friends and family a shock. Their once aware, very atheist daughter did not have memory of the prior month or countless people she had interacted with, suddenly continuously repeating the statement, "God is good." Now, in the day, I could not move, my paralyzed body making me a captive within the edges of the hospital bed. And in the nights, I could not sleep, the constant beeping of the oxygen indicator attached to the tip of my finger, and the restrictions of comfort caused by the tubes and needles sticking out of my hands and neck. On the 6th night, I got my first proper night's sleep, and I woke up somewhat aware, endlessly motivated. Standing was difficult and tiring, and having forgotten the ability to walk, I could only stand upright for a few minutes before falling onto the nearest chair. And I was sick of dealing with the consequences of the constant betrayal of my body. And suddenly, I was faced with the overwhelming revelation. What if I had it wrong the whole time? What if it was not my poor health who was the perpetrator for all this misery, but rather the constant deflection and lack of discipline of my mind? And no longer did I blame my body, for I had turned into mere flesh, but I blamed the constant running my mind had done from all the difficulty and uncomfort in my life. And truthfully, the body will always fight against us. The body is comfortable, it knows it will eventually perish and therefore does not care about improvement. But the mind is willing. And as long as the body is submissive to that will, the body will surprise you in how strong it really is. In that hospital bed, spending hours practicing walking step by step, I quickly realized that the only way to improve and take back control is to live in a constant state of challenge. To allow pain and uncomfort to prevent the body from getting comfortable and having control. Now, in my favorite book, Looking for Alaska, John Green emphasizes that life is simply a labyrinth of suffering. And that there's two ways to approach this labyrinth. One being straight and fast, either to go through it recklessly or not to go through it at all. Or two, you can recognize the importance of life's twists and turns and approach it with excitement on where it will lead you. And that is my philosophy. And now, a few months ago, I met someone who studied dream analysis in order to interpret the subconscious mind. And as I explained the dreams I endured whilst in my coma, he laughed and he patted me on the shoulder. It was your rebirth, he told me. The death of your past self to make a room for a new and improved one. And I stared at him, skeptical, until he asked me a question. How did the experience change you? When I look at my past self before the coma in comparison to my present self, there is an unfathomable difference in who I am for the better. And that needed to happen to me. I needed to change, and so through a set of events I did. The details, they no longer matter. The only reason that after 2 years I'm telling this story today is not to reminisce, or to get closure, or to leave you all terrified of life, because you shouldn't be, but to leave you all with a very important message. To approach pain and uncomfort and challenge with humility and perseverance. To welcome all that is bad because it is so worthless to neglect it. These are the days that must happen to you. Don't forget them, don't push them away, for they are the basis of our being and the brush which paints our future. Thank you.